Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Cognition Ignition. So if you want to really unlock the highest levels of your intuition, then you really need to start mastering the skill of pattern recognition. If you are an intuitive type, this probably makes sense to you, but in general, we don't have a lot of opportunity to develop the pattern recognition unless it's very intentional. So for myself, I've used my pattern recognition to help me build businesses, help other people, including my wife, build businesses. I've used it to help my employees develop their own sense of self and integrate aspects of themselves into their own life. I've used it more recently in my education, where I'm going to school for psychology and doing a lot of work in neuroscience. I need to use pattern recognition. And what I realized is, there were things I did when I was young that allowed me to develop this skill of pattern recognition. And I think if other people would like to develop a stronger sense of pattern recognition, I can help them build the skills. But there are a lot of things that you're going to have to do. There's stages to pattern recognition. There's at least 8 stages to pattern recognition. But once you get through the first 4, which takes a lot of time and a lot of work, the other ones start building up a lot faster. That's when you can bring that skill set of pattern recognition into other industries and other areas of your life over and over again. And every time, if you're using your pattern recognition and you're intentional about it, every time that you enter into something new, you are going to be able to recognize the patterns quickly and make faster decisions, better decisions. And it's as long as you keep iterating through the skill, you will find different ways to use it. And that's kind of when you get up to these higher levels, which I will go over in future episodes. But for today, I really want to go over some ways that you can do it and just the whole process. So as I said, most people will never give themselves the opportunity to develop the skill of pattern recognition, primarily because it requires a lot of autonomy and self-drive, as well as an ability to actually use those patterns. So by either performing or making high-level decisions, often impactful decisions. So that's the first thing, is that it has to be autonomous, something that you're choosing to do, something that you're choosing to engage with. This is also related to the fact that intuition is strongly related to your emotions. If it's not something that you are choosing to do, then you may not be looking for the patterns as naturally as you would be if it was something that you were vested into and very interested in being engaged with. Beyond that, it takes time to develop the skill of pattern recognition. You need to iterate through the basics of something to move on to the deeper patterns where your brain basically instantly makes the connection to something. And it has to be tied to a passion and outcomes. You can do something just for fun, but at some point you are going to have to use what you are doing in a way that has measurable outcomes. So for me, and I know a lot of people who are into type like myself aren't necessarily going to realize this, but for me, they aren't going to necessarily, a lot of people who are into type aren't necessarily going to realize that intuition, is introverted intuition, and the pattern recognition that it is associated with really comes from engagement in the sensory world and either picking up a skill or a deep interest that you're spending a lot of time with. So for me personally, it was wrestling. Overall, I would say it was grappling, because I moved from wrestling to jiu-jitsu, maybe even combat sports in general, because I did some other types of Muay Thai and things like that. But overall, I would say when I first realized I have these moments and I spend a lot of time simulating in my own head how things are going to work, and then, actually making that impact in the world, was definitely wrestling. But for you, it could be something else. It could be a sport, art, or music. Those are pretty basic things that you can start learning. They're skills that you can just start picking up as long as it's an interest to you and you have autonomy in learning it. Those are good areas to start. If you already have a skill that you've already vested into and you think you've mastered it and you have some form of mastery, you can kind of advance this a little bit farther. Also, trades would also work, some kind of trade, if it's something that interests you. I've met people with strong intuition who are mechanics. or some type of programmer. There's a bunch of different things that you can engage with in the outer world that will allow you to start building up these patterns, right? And it's way more broad than most people are going to realize. I think a lot of this gets tied to like doing just research or doing something just scientific, but I think it's broader than that. I think it's anything. Doing research is the same thing as learning a sport in a different way. The most important thing is that you want to have a single focus that is heading towards a long-term outcome or a lot of short-term outcomes. So for myself with grappling, it was, there were the practices, but then there was the competition. And what happens is that once you decide you want to master something, for me, when I chose to master wrestling, it requires more than just participation. And for myself, I would say anything I go into, I look to be more than a participant. I don't just go to something and be told what to do. This is essential for developing pattern recognition. You have to have your own will and drive to learn something, master it, take on the responsibilities or the actions that you need to take on to master it. We're going to get into what that means exactly in a few minutes. But really, when you're learning these things, you're forcing yourself to like these new extremes physically and psychologically. You are going to exhaust yourself because you are so vested into something. You're going to put hours of deliberate practice or research or, just taking in the patterns of that arena that you're in. So for me with wrestling, basically, as you will do with anything that you decide, you're going to learn the basic parts of something, and hopefully whatever you get into has a way for you to perform or compete in some kind of way that will allow you to challenge yourself, because true intuition develops through the challenging moments. You get these sudden insights when you do something that you didn't know you could do, or you realize that you could handle something a way that you didn't. But this comes from a lot of introspective work, reflection, simulating how you want to be, not just how you are. But you also have to catch, like, hey, these are things I do, or these are emotions that come up when something happens. These are the thoughts that come up when I go to certain environments. And you're going to start, like, for me, it's natural. So I guess at first you have to teach yourself how to do this. I had a wrestling coach that taught me how to do these mentalization and visualization techniques. After years of doing them, it became something I do everywhere before I go into a business, before I go into a staff meeting, before I go into most conversations. I'm doing a lot of simulating, mental visualization, and things like that. And I think that that's where a lot of the pattern recognition comes from. So, when you first go into something, what you're really doing is you're making the unconscious conscious. You're realizing there's things that you don't know. There's effects within you that you don't know are going to come up, especially if you've never been in this environment. Like wrestling, it's the basic moves, but then you realize I'm sore. So then you have to figure out how to not be sore anymore. You have to figure out how to recover better. You have to figure out how your energy levels work. When am I going to eat? When's the best time to eat? Should I eat before practice? Should I eat after practice? And these are basically, you're getting these internal patterns. You're picking up these sensations, the feelings that come up for yourself. But beyond that, wrestling also requires that you have strong emotional control. So in the actual process of wrestling, you're working on not showing your emotions, keeping yourself calm, cool, and collected, so that way you can focus on the target that you're going to be approaching. And then, you spend hours and hours practicing. After practice, I would go into the saunas. And in the sauna, I'd be simulating in my head, what did I do wrong at practice? How do I want to compete this weekend at the tournament? I'd be like, do I know my opponent? Do I not know my opponent? If I didn't know my opponent, what do I know about him? What's his record? What have I heard about him? Beyond that, if I did know my opponent, I think to myself, what did I do against him last time that I probably shouldn't do this time, because he's probably planning about it. He's probably planning a way to stop me from doing it. What could I have done better that, to defend something that he does? And I'm just simulating these over and over again in my head when this happens. And I think that it doesn't necessarily, I think a lot of people want to tie the intuition to meditation. I think it's more simulation than it is meditation. And the patterns continue to get deeper and deeper. After a competition, I decide where did I play my game? Where did I stop myself from playing my game? Did I get distracted by people in the stands, or was somebody there that distracted me? And then I teach myself through these simulations to not allow that to happen anymore. I start recalling the feelings and sensations that come up, and I start to control them. And this is why, at its top, pattern recognition is control of all your sensations, feelings, and thoughts. And it's not just internal patterns. I have to recognize external patterns and then see how those external patterns affect my internal patterns. So when you're picking up these external patterns, it could be simply like the move, the defense to the move, the counter to the defense, the idea of how you want to perform. Like in wrestling, there's this general idea of go. You don't really stop, so you actually have to teach yourself to block out the tiredness that comes up in wrestling. And this is all done through simulation. It's, you can go practice the moves, and you get moments in those that allow you to start simulating something, but then you have to continue simulating. You have to be so vested into the thing that you are doing. When I was in high school and I was wrestling, I lost girlfriends because I put all my time and energy into my simulations. They would ask me, why can't we hang out? You're home, you're not going to practice. And I'd say, because I'm planning, and I'm, a lot of times I was fasting because I was cutting weight or something like that. And then even, a pattern that came up for me when I was about a junior was, I realized cutting weight wasn't the best way for me to perform. I ended up in an argument with my coach about this. But when I came back my senior year, I didn't cut weight, and I ended up making it to my state championships and things like that. And it was a pattern I recognized in myself, where it was a tradition for people to cut weight, and it still is. I realize, if I can have my full energy, I don't really need to cut the weight, though I had done it previously when I began wrestling, because I think at that time it was. Once I had become a master in my technique, it wasn't so necessary. So I'm picking up these external patterns, I'm visualizing them, I'm creating mental models of all possibilities that could happen with my opponent, variations even from what I've known before, what I know they could be working on if they were already good at a certain move, and even normal expectations versus alternative methods that I could be using. There's some general rules that you can break in certain scenarios, and I start to figure out where can I do that. So then I start to look into the more internal patterns, right? I start to see what is my process of handling the patterns, the stimuli basically. And I take them all in. And then start preparing. And this is my intuition preparing for something. So these kind of patterns are simple things like fatigue and energy levels, cortisol spikes or adrenaline rushes. And I'm starting to learn how to control them. That's the important thing, is that I'm controlling how I want to engage with these internal subjective factors that are coming up. And this is just basically the unconscious. Unless you take time to recognize that your stomach's turning because you're anxious about going into a match, it's unconscious to you. And then, beyond that, it's once those simulations are run, there's a point in time where there's no turning back. I'm at the competition. 10 minutes before, I'm simulating in my head. I've gotten an idea of who my opponent is, and I start simulating, based on those already built simulations. And then I go out into the match and I execute to that simulation. I try not to change my game plan at all. I have a game plan. And in the same way, you can do this with anything. You can do it with your music. You can do it with art, but you have to put yourself out there. You can't just let it sit. And honestly, I take this to my videos now. I'm simulating for days before I actually make these videos. And then I come on here and I try to execute. For me, the biggest part of the simulation is that I don't want to leave a lot of information out. So I've used simulations to decide how I'm going to approach my videos, which is break them down into smaller pieces. And this is something that I do in business and pretty much anywhere that I'm in. It's just I'm simulating. Right now, I'm kind of simulating how would I put out these videos. So that's the idea, and that's going to get you to a basic level of, like, you use extroverted intuition, you use introverted intuition, you pick up the patterns externally, you see how those patterns affect you internally, and you begin integrating by taking a meta perspective of these things. You're taking a perspective of the external and the internal world, and you begin transforming yourself based on that. You act the way that you want to do. You become the things you want to become and do the things you want to do. And what this really is, and something that I've really realized, is I've always preached, like, hey, you have to bring the unconscious up to your consciousness. And what you're doing is, it's a simulation, and you're playing with it, kind of. You're manipulating it, you're changing the factors, the variables that can come up, and all these things. And then once you do that, you have to push it back down into the unconscious. That's the point. That's the part that's been left out. A lot of people keep it up into conscious, especially like the NE-DOMs who want to start using intuition. You have to push it into the unconscious, and a way to do that is by putting yourself in an environment where you actually have to use it. You have to test it, to go through the iterations, and then after you do that, you can pull it back up and start manipulating again. This is how I would rather it be next time. This is what I would like to see happen. This is how I would like to change. And then you start mentalizing that, and you start doing it, right? So your first external patterns you're bringing up from the unconscious is just through the interaction, how something actually works, the logic of something, the pieces that go together. And then from that, you start engaging, and, your body starts acting a certain way. It starts sending signals through your hormones and your neurotransmitters, and those are the internal patterns. They do create images. They create you start to realize, like, there feels like there's a ball in my shoulder, or there's a knot in my stomach, or things like that, right? These are the internal patterns. They're kind of getting a sense of, how do I respond? And then even extending that, how would I like to? You're transforming that perception into, like, how would I rather respond? And then when you see it, like, integrated, it's like, what can I actually do? It's like putting the steps in, and you're integrating it into the unconscious. There are things that just become things that you do. You don't have to think about them anymore. You're not worrying about the same problem over and over again. You have a solution because you simulated every possibility and then narrowed down to, like, this is how I'm going to handle it, regardless of almost anything else. And then you put the trust in yourself to go out and do this. And this is, like I said, basic pattern recognition. In my future videos, when I go over this, I'm going to talk about how, when you take in all of the external, there's even more where things begin developing, such as, like, spirit of competition, which I've talked about before, and how that affects you when you have, like, it's beyond camaraderie because it's so much into yourself, but you have teammates that you build up with. And then, to get to those really high levels of intuition, you need to start using it, and then go cross domain. All these patterns that you recognize about yourself right now. What do you recognize about yourself when you go take over a business or go open a business? There's going to be times when your heart rate gets up, or you're very stressed, and once you know how to mentalize, you can start mentalizing with it. And when these things come up, these images, these stressors, don't just push them down to the unconscious until you begin manipulating them and moving them around the way that you want to, and you form them into what you want, so that way you have them to use. And I think if you guys do this, if you do this, like I'm telling you, it's not instant. It takes a long time. It takes years and years of mastery, and it's because you're not mastering just the logic of something. You are mastering how you work with that thing, and then also mastering where it's going forward. Like, now I coach wrestlers. I can look at a wrestler and tell you probably what their best stance is, what their best techniques are going to be, based on just, years of realizing, like, your body looks like this is going to be your best setup. People will move the way that you want them to because your body is formed for that. And then beyond that, like, I realize when the kids that I'm wrestling are getting, burnt out, or they're not paying attention to the right things. And it's just something that comes to me. I'm just like, that's what they're doing. And it's not something that you're probably born with a tendency for it, but it's not just like, you're going to be born with it. You need to hone in on the skill. You need to be intentional about it. You need to put yourself into something that you're going to want to do this. I basically, like I said, even with type, I know there were times when I was waking up in the middle of the night and my brain was simulating. All it wanted to do was simulate these things. And I think if everybody can do it, or can at least work on it, I don't think everybody's going to get to the highest levels. But you can begin finding the patterns that are affecting you and then changing the external patterns. Once you recognize them, you're going to have the confidence and the demeanor that you want, because that's what recognizing the internal patterns and working with them will allow you to do, is take control, not only of the external, but of the internal. So that's what I have. If you have any questions or you want any specific details, let me know in the comments, and I will catch you on the next episode of Cognition Ignition. Thanks for watching.